So you found the skeleton. How would you tell it's a dinosaur? You personally, how would you decide?
Well, interesting question. I don't know. I'd have to do some research on that.
Hey there YouTube, the Dapper Dinosaur here with another update on the Speculative Evolution project. This is an update for Phase 2, we're not even close to the end of it though, so don't worry. Unfortunately, new entries have closed, and they've actually been closed for a fair while. But that's okay, I have a lot to get through, and I'm sorry that this has taken a little while, but there's been stuff going on both on and off the channel that has meant that work has had to slow down a bit. That being said, we still have 8 new organisms to show off today, as well as a little bit of note-keeping for future entries. First up, we have the sea tumbleweed. Here pictured, having grabbed a juvenile proto-mesanid and its tendrils, which it is about to kill and move into its oral cavity. And this creature design is by Ding Dong. The sea tumbleweed has a conservative Xenoradiaton Ba plan. It retains the full pentaradial symmetry, 5 tentacles, 5 eyes, and 10 tendrils of its feather barrel ancestor. And it also has a genital-respiratory system that is largely intact. The biggest change are that at either end of the creature, the tentacles no longer secrete glue, and instead are used to move the creature across the substrate, giving the tumbleweed a much more active lifestyle than its ancestors, although not too active. It moves at speeds comparable to a starfish on Earth. The feeding fronds bear sharp hooks tipped with keratin and feature a dangerous surprise. Acetic acid is pumped into the tips of the claws, which helps incapacitate prey, which, rather than being primarily plankton, now include nectonic creatures of larger size than the ancestral feather barrel ever could have eaten. The body is almost completely round in order to facilitate the tumbleweed's main defense strategy, rapid retreat. When it senses danger, water is quickly drawn into the respiratory channels and expelled forcefully through the channel nearest the perceived threat. This causes the creature to roll away rather comically. While this does protect them from hungry predators, it is not entirely safe, and older specimens typically feature numerous scars on their tough skin from scrapes and cuts they have gained from their tumbling antics. These scars form rapidly as their skin tissues create new tough and somewhat keratinized tissue to heal cuts quite rapidly. Another major adaptation is that the tumbleweed has a true through-gut, and it excretes waste through an anus at the center of its legs. Tumbleweeds, like their ancestors, are hermaphroditic broadcast spawners, whose larvae form a part of the zooplankton. Tumbleweeds are bottom dwellers in the epipelagic zone, preferring cold waters around Arctica and the east and southern coasts of Chatang. Feather barrels eat relatively large prey such as proto-mesanids, filter globe relatives, and even the occasional proboscis gnathid or invertebrate gnathid juvenile. The tumbleweed's visual acuity is significantly better than its ancestors. This helps it not only track prey, but also watch out for potential predators. Next up, we have a twofer. We have the purple pitcher plant and the tube barrel. I'm going to be starting with the pitcher plant, which is the retinophyte that you can see in this picture. Both of these two were designed by Ryan Draghi. The purple pitcher plant is a retinophyte that hosts a symbiotic creature which it feeds in exchange for cleaning and protection. And in the background, one is being defended from a grazing Durospina by its companion. Purple pitcher plants have a fairly basal photosynthetic apparatus, including the reproductive depression on each of its 3 leaves. It does have some unusual features, however. Its rhizoid forms a bulb below the surface, and it has foregone sending out shoots for vegetative reproduction, although the bulb still does send out smaller, thinner tendrils for mineral uptake. The other major adaptation is the eponymous pitcher. This structure is formed to hold a single tube barrel, a symbiotic Xenoradiaton. The pitcher plant, as a rule, grows exactly 3 leaves. Purple pitcher plants are sexually reproducing diploid creatures. When their hosts prepare to mate, the male tube barrel will rub its lower tentacles on the reproductive depressions of its host before approaching a female. This brings its haploid spores, which will fertilize the spores of the female's host, as her eggs are being fertilized by the male. However, because any purple pitcher plant may be host to either a male or female tube barrel, they remain anisogamous. Purple pitcher plants can be found in many of the same areas as Boscio magno stands, fulfilling the role of undergrowth in these areas, and they are able to quickly fill in gaps in coverage because they are infrequently consumed, as those who try get a face full of sharp feeding fronds from a surprisingly fierce Xenoradiaton. These organisms can be found worldwide in the epipelagic zone, only being excluded from the coldest areas around Arctica. And now we have their companion, the tube barrel. The tube barrel is a symbiotic Xenoradiaton pictured here with its symbiote, the purple pitcher plant. Again, designed by Ryan Draghi. Tube barrels are an example of neoteny. They never actually develop their lower appendages into the cement-secreting form of the adult, and their respiro-reproductive tracts remain fully functional for locomotion. Otherwise, however, the anatomy is fairly conservative, retaining all the major parts of the ancestral feather barrel, and all of them in essentially the same place as its ancestor. The eyes are proportionally large and have many photoreceptive cells, allowing for a high degree of visual acuity. Additionally, the ganglion in each radial segment is quite large and extends laterally. They are all connected to each other by large nerve bundles protected by a thick layer of cartilage. This relatively advanced nervous system allows for complex coordination of the animal's lower appendages, respirogenital organs, and the feeding fronds on the top of its body, all of which are used to coordinate its relatively complex behavior. The projections to either side of the feeding fronds are partially mineralized and are used to stab at threats. Tube barrels have two sexes and reproduce via external fertilization. A cluster of eggs are placed at the center of the purple pitcher plant's leaves, where the spores are developing. Because the two species have evolved together for a few million years, they tend to produce similar numbers of eggs and spores. The spores and eggs adhere to each other, generally 1-to-1, although sometimes other ratios occur. The tube barrel eggs and spore will drift to a new location together, and assuming appropriate conditions, they will start to grow together. If there is more than one spore attached to an egg, the tube barrel will simply pick one as its host. If, on the other hand, more than one egg is attached to a spore, the tube barrels will battle for dominance, with the loser generally swimming off. If it's lucky, it may find an unguarded purple pitcher plant, but generally it will die. Tube barrels can be found in many of the same places as Basio magno-stands, their hosts fulfilling the role of undergrowth in these areas, and they are able to quickly fill in gaps in coverage because they are infrequently consumed. Tube barrels eat mostly microbes that are on the surface of their host, and the nutritive sap that is exuded near the base of their hosts. While they are resting in their host's pitcher, they will also snare any passing plankton that gets close enough to their feeding fronds to supplement their diet. Tube barrels have surprisingly complex behavior. It is not quite fair to call them intelligent, but they have much more complicated nervous systems than most of their contemporaries. While they still act on instinct, this instinct is complex and requires careful coordination. Their eyes are large and rather sensitive, and due to the consecutive bands of muscles around their perimeter, their shape can be adjusted somewhat to change their focal length. They are also backed by a high concentration of photoreceptive cells, overall giving them some of the best sight at this point in Almaisha's history. The fronds are very sensitive to pressure and are chemoreceptors. The bottom appendages are somewhat sensitive to touch, although much less so than the feeding fronds. Next up, we have the sleeping fish, again by Ding Dong. In the depths of the ocean, a sleeping fish is pictured here, hunting out some detritus that may have fallen from above. Dirba hypnokamala, the sleeping fish, have adapted their ancestral fins into walking limbs on most of the segments of their body. Their adorned head is covered in large, flat, armored plates, with spiked protrusions on the dorsal margin and the posteroventral corners projecting posterolaterally for defense. They use hardened points on the ventral surface of the anterior portion of the first tagma to break the hard shells of prey and carcasses by repeatedly slamming their heads against them and disturbing sediment like a hoe. Once prey is reasonably chewed, they can consume the meal through the leech-like mouth on the underside of their head. Sleeping fish species are also sexually dimorphic, with the last tagma of their body having claspers adapted from its ancestral fins. They do not have any parental instinct, and females will bury and abandon their eggs upon fertilization. Small simple brains are present in the anterior tagma. Their gills remain quite basal, having a small frill of external gills extending from the back of each segment. Due to their diet including fractal trees, which contain copper and some iron, and copper-shelled filter feeders in the depths, they have hardened their armor with these elements. The teeth on their headplate are brown due to rusting as large deposits of these metals build up on them, strengthening them. To combat hard prey, their heads have grown large and wider, giving space for large neck muscles. Due to the heavy weight caused by their strong armor, their legs have become stronger and more compressed, built mainly just for pushing the body along the seafloor as they have lost free swimming capabilities. During mating, females will release strong scents from their cloaca, attracting the males, and when releasing eggs, they release all of them in a large sac before burying them in the sediment. Sometimes these sacs can retain the scent, and other sleeping fish may cannibalize the eggs. Sleeping fish live on the abyssal plain near hydrothermal vents. Sleeping fish feed on radiotrophs, and will opportunistically feed on any smaller creatures it comes across, as well as larger chunks of marine snow. Chemoreceptors are positioned on the front edge of the underside of their head and around their mouth. Due to the lack of light, they have lost functional eyes in favor of pressure sensors acting like a sense of long-range touch, manifesting as large bumps on the tops of their headplate. Next up, we have the Wort Melon, again by Ding Dong. The Wort Melon is a Basio descendant, part of the same genus as Cardobasian. These Basio plants have adapted to life in the shallow waters of the intertidal zone of the equatorial continents. Pictured here in a calm bay on the coast of Natash. The namesake melon developed from an enlarged rhizoid originally meant to help anchor the plant in tidal zones, but eventually became an important part of energy stores. In times of limited water, it stores large quantities of water and some nutrients to keep the plant alive, and as such, if the leaves and stem are removed with time and if the melon contains enough stores of energy, they could regrow new leaves. The main nutrient exchange takes place in extensions of the melon. Long, wispy, fan-like roots extend from the melon. The melon itself and the stem are covered in a thick, bumpy, striped rind, which is filled with cyanogenic glycoside, a toxic compound derived from simple sugars. This rind provides defense from herbivores with toxin, as well as structure and to limit drying out of the plant while water may not be present to support the leaves. Once a plant has grown its maximum 3 leaves, a root will extend out and grow a small bulb. During this time, a plant is vulnerable as it is dedicating many nutrients to asexually producing a small bulb, which eventually grows into its own melon. Through this reproduction tactic, wort melons can create large fields of the plant, all interconnected, and can even vaguely communicate by sending chemical messages through the roots, such as distress chemicals. Some of these plants can respond by flooding their neighbors with their own toxin to better protect them or share more nutrients during times of need. The wort melon is common in the intertidal zones in the tropics, specifically in the southern coasts of Natas, all around Borea, and the western coasts of Ras Al Khaimah. Wort melons also exist in some brackish estuaries with some tidal depth variation. You can usually identify the starting plant of an old colony as they sometimes hoard nutrients for themselves, sometimes leading to the melon becoming greatly over-engorged, leaving very little to none of the stem and leaves underwater in shallower habitats. So far, no wort melon species has made the jump to being fully terrestrial. On average, these plants are only about 2 to 2.5 inches tall, melon to leaf. Next up, we have the cage-gill worm, and unfortunately, I think I lost the actual original email for this creature, so if you created this, please let me know and I will mention you in the pinned comment. Here, a cage-gill worm is pictured chasing a protomysanid that may be a bit too big for it. Like their ancestors, the cage-gill worms have segmented bodies with several pairs of eyes, though there are notable differences in their anatomy as well. Cage-gill worms' eyes only go as far back as the 8th segment and are situated on tall stalks that support the eyes. The pair in front are far more advanced, being able to detect movement and some depth, while the other 7 pairs are only functional in comparing differences in light and dark. Other differences are the first pair of fins and the first gill set that have become modified into a cage-like structure used in feeding. The tail has developed a fluke used to help in propulsion and greater movement. Cage-gill worms spend most of their lives as a solitary hunter, using their adapted front gills and fins as a way of trapping or capturing prey before using rounded teeth in the interior of their mouth to grind and crush them up. But during the latter half of a local year, cage-gill worms will meet near shallow deltas and broadcast spawn, releasing thousands of eggs and sperm into the water before returning to deeper waters for hunting. Juveniles start as what are referred to as gillets, who spend the first year of their life near sediment, fishing out small particles and microbial life to eat. Gillets are around 0.4 centimeters in length and height. After about 1 year, the juvenile will be fully mature, but won't reach its full size until about another 3/4 of a local year. Cage-gill worms are pelagic creatures who will dive into the twilight zone but spend most of their time in the photic zone. They, however, spend most of their time away from continental shelves, swimming towards land only to breed. Next up, we have the rock fruit, again by Ding Dong. The water fruit is a primarily sessile filter feeder that lives from the epipelagic to the upper limits of the mesopelagic zone. It burrows into the sand and can wiggle its rotund body to bury itself deeper if it senses danger. Here it is pictured at the highest part of its range off the west coast of Natas, among a stand of Bosio magno that are themselves near the deepest part of their range. Note this picture is a cutaway in order to show the submerged portion of the creature's anatomy. Their body structure is quite basal, with their adaptations being almost entirely dedicated to a life spent buried in the sediment. The skin of rock fruit is very tough and partially mineralized. Due to the unjointed nature of this creature, this mineralization cannot form a completely rigid shell, but it is still significant work to break through for any predator. Their eyes are largely enveloped in flesh, and so are a bit atrophied, although their ability to focus is somewhat enhanced, and the muscles and nerves that surrounded the basal feather barrel have elongated, giving the rock fruit some ability to move its stalks to focus on a specific threat. So this atrophy is more than compensated for. The feeding tendrils have developed long strands which secrete a sticky substance that is used to trap prey, which is then directed towards the mouth. The eye stalks also have similar filamentous structures, but these are sensory in purpose, rather than meant for feeding. The bottom tentacles are much reduced in size, but still function for assisting in burrowing in the substrate. The respirogenital outlets are very high up on the organism to allow for them to function even if the animal is mostly buried in sediment. This has put some pressure on the simple hearts, and so they have moved in medially towards the stomach. Rock fruits are true hermaphrodites with anisogamous gametes that are broadcast spawn once a year. The larval period is quite short, spent mainly consuming sand and other mineral sediment, so that when they develop and become sessile, they can develop a thick, heavily mineralized hide. Rock fruit live from the epipelagic to the upper mesopelagic zones west of Natas and Borea and southwest of Yama. Strands on the eye stalks function as simple pressure and current detectors. The eyes are worse at collecting light than in the ancestral form, but they are better at image forming and are more mobile. So overall, the eyesight can be said to be slightly better in the rock fruit than in its ancestral feather barrel. And last, we have the wormfish, another designed by Ding Dong. The wormfish is a bottom dweller in the dim twilight zones of Almaisha, around the margins of Yama and Natash. The cephalic gills are retracted in this picture due to it being startled. Wormfish have adapted their ancestral fins into modestly efficient walking limbs on most of their segments of their body. Their adorned head is covered in large, flat, armored plates, with spiked protrusions on the dorsal margin, and the posterolateral corners projecting posterolaterally for defense. They use hardened points on the ventral surface of the anterior portion of the first tagma to break hard shells of prey and carcasses by repeatedly slamming their heads against them and disturbing sediment, much like a hoe. Once prey is reasonably well chewed, they can consume the meal through the leech-like mouth on the underside of their head. Wormfish species are also sexually dimorphic, with the last tagma of their body having claspers adapted from ancestral fins in males. They do not have any parental instincts, and females will bury and abandon their eggs upon fertilization. Small, simple brains are present in the interiormost tagma. Their gills remain quite basal, having a small frill of external gills extending from the back of each segment. But unlike their deep-sea cousins, wormfish have retained the ability to free swim, and their locomotive fins are not as compact and dedicated to walking across the seafloor. To aid in quick escape from the seafloor, they have adapted the last tagma of their body into a downturned whale or dolphin-like fluke for most efficient lift. They paddle their many fins to aid in balance, and as a side effect of their use in free swimming, their armor is a bit lighter than the related sleeping fish, being more leathery and being almost completely gone in the fluke tagma. Their gills posterior to the cephalon are also partially internalized, with large feathery fins on the second tagma spasmodically beating to force water across them. Those larger fins for the second tagma are not used for locomotion and are incredibly thin and delicate, being filled primarily with large veins. These fins are mainly kept folded and close to the body, but during mating season or when threatened by a predator, they will fan them out and pump them with their hemocyanin-based blood, giving them a large blue frill to scare off would-be attackers and attract mates. Their frontmost tagma is thin and mainly built for hydrodynamics, with two large spikes on the bottom and a ramp-shaped crest on the front, allowing for more effective disturbance of the sediment. The gills on this tagma have evolved into long whisker-like feelers, and some pressure-sensing bumps can be found on their snout. They have also retained two simple eyes which are placed on the top of their head for better spotting of predators, but limiting their range of view. During mating, females will release strong scents from their cloaca, attracting males, and when releasing eggs, they will release all of them in a large sac before burying them in the sediment. Sometimes these sacs can retain the scent and other wormfish will cannibalize the eggs. Wormfish live around the continents of Yama and Natash. Wormfish are mostly scavengers, but will also hunt for what prey they can find in their dimly lit habitat. They feed primarily on the remains of other animals, as well as phytozoans. Chemoreceptors are positioned at the front edge of the underside of their head and around their mouth. Due to the lack of light, they have lost most function in their eyes in favor of pressure sensors acting like a sense of long-range touch, manifesting as large bumps on the top of the head plate. The eyes are on the posterodorsal portion of the cephalon and are covered in a thin layer of skin and keratin to protect them. They largely only detect light levels, which aids in keeping the circadian rhythms of the organisms in sync with the planet's rotation. Well, that's all we have for new creatures for now. However, I do want to add a few things. One is that there seems to be some confusion from many people who have submitted creatures or who are discussing this on the Discord server around the difference between a tagma and a segment. So I have pictured here a scorpion. Scorpions have two tagmata, which is the plural for tagma. One tagma is the cephalon, which contains the legs, the feeding appendages, the eyes, etc. The other is the telson, or tail. This is the part of the scorpion that is the stingy bit. Each tagma is itself divided into segments. So remember, a tagma is a group of segments that have become a unit that is used for some biological function. So for instance, in insects, there's a head tagma that's used for gathering food and sensing the environment. Then there's a thorax segment that's primarily used for pumping around internal fluids and locomotion. Then there's an abdomen segment that's used primarily for reproduction and digestion. The head, thorax, and abdomen of an insect are tagmata, and each of them is composed of multiple segments. So I just wanted to get that out of there. And the other one is a minor little thing about binomial nomenclature. Binomial nomenclature is, of course, the way that a species is uniquely identified with a genus and species name. For instance, humans are Homo sapiens. I'm using the binomial nomenclature system in this project. So for instance, the wormfish is Ichthyodracon wushui. Please note that a binomial should always be italicized, and the genus name, but not the species name, should be capitalized. So when I start Phase 3, I'm hoping we can be a little bit more consistent with submissions, and so I'm actually going to make a form that can be filled out, and it will have different categories such as anatomy, feeding behavior, and things like that you can fill out. Not every single one needs to absolutely be filled out, but you should give thought to what could go in all of them at the very least. That being said, Phase 3 is still probably a fair bit off because I have a lot of submissions to go through. If you like this, please remember to hit subscribe, and also follow me on Twitter where you can get updates about what creatures are being finished as I finish them. There's usually somewhere around 2 or 3 creatures every week that go up there, although that can vary. Additionally, look at the World Anvil, which is linked in the description, where you can find pictures and text descriptions. The text descriptions are primarily written by the people who submitted them. That's it for me for today. I'm the Dapper Dinosaur. Thanks for watching. But before you go, I'd like to take a minute to thank my patrons, especially my $20 and above patrons. Ben Tovand, Ian Chen, Speed of Sound, Chris Love, Henry Hutanen, Bob Knob, The Evil Scotsman. My patrons help make this channel possible, and if you'd like to join the team over on Patreon, you can get early access to videos, polls, as well as an exclusive Discord server for patrons only. The minimum tier is only $1 a month, and it goes all the way up to $100 a month if you're feeling really generous. If you'd still like to help the channel, but you feel like a monthly pledge isn't right for you, I also have a Teespring store where you can get merchandise including t-shirts and even a really cool fleece blanket. I also have an Amazon wishlist linked in the description. And if none of those are right for you, then simply just liking and sharing this video is a huge help to the channel. It really helps get me more views and more subscribers, and helps the channel grow.
So you found the skeleton. How would you tell people that is you personally? How would you decide?
Well, interesting question. I don't know. I'd have to do some research on this.